and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked that little update on the Conn Smythe betting odds, but as always in this hyped NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals atmosphere, we always transition in our first two segments from hockey and basketball and hockey. We keep on bouncing back and forth. I promise next week, should the Celtics sweep and the Panthers kind of take control of this series, it'll be tamped down and we can get more into the nitty-gritty of other sports. But this is how it will stay for the last couple of days here. So we switch from the NHL to the NBA, where, let's just say, a game happened last night in the NBA Finals between the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks. Ultimately, the Boston Celtics taking complete and utter control of this series, in my humble opinion, with a 106-99 victory. Let's just go over the fantasy stats before I go into the implications of this game as well. Luka Doncic obviously had a very good fantasy game, 42.4 points, very respectable for him. 27, 6, and 6 in terms of his stat line. But the big surprise of the Dallas Mavericks, Kyrie Irving, finally showed up. I know it was to no avail, they didn't win the game, but Kyrie Irving, as we know him and love him, kind of showed up. He had 39.6 fantasy points, 35, 3, and 2 stat line. Really helped Dallas to kind of dominate most of the large portions of this game. But let's switch over to the Celtics. Jason Tatum also stepping up in terms of scoring output. So, haters, if you're there, does this prove you guys wrong? We'll see. 45.7 fantasy points, 31, 6, and 5 stat line. And obviously, Jaylen Brown, the leading fantasy scorer, surprised there after Luka has taken the fantasy world by storm in this finals. 50.6 fantasy points for Jaylen Brown, 38 and 8 stat line. Now, in terms of fantasy fallout implications surrounding this game, I'm going to say something weird in those terms. This certainly does not feel like it was the best barometer for how this series has gone fantasy-wise. Mainly for two reasons. One, there was a Kristaps Porzingis-sized hole in the Celtics lineup that they kind of had to figure out. And B, Luka fouling out really could have been the difference between him having 40 fantasy points and maybe 50-55 fantasy points. Let's start, although, with the Kristaps Porzingis-sized hole in the roster. There's a lot of questions surrounding that. If Kristaps Porzingis was in the lineup, do Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown elevate their level of scoring? Does that subtract from the high level of fantasy output that both of them had? That certainly can be an interesting question, but at this moment in time, we'll never know. The fact of the matter is they just stepped up when it mattered, and so it is right now. In terms of Luka's foul out, I think that in the grand scheme of things, yes, it's unprofessional, but still it's Luka. It's Luka Doncic. He's always going to be one of the better fantasy basketball players. I certainly think he was detrimental to the whole Dallas organization last night. He let his teammates down in clutch time by doing that. But frustration for a player of that caliber can definitely set in when, things aren't going your way and you just have to suck it up and accept it for what it is. I just think that Luka will have a bounce-back game and will tell us a lot about his character, not only as a real-life player, but as a fantasy player, because I know he has it in him. We have seen it countless times in both the regular season and postseason. Luka Doncic is never truly down. But from the Celtics side of things, only two major things surprised me about this Celtics performance. One, the fact that they were able to weather both storms, being down 13 early in the first and then up 21 early in the second and kind of early into the fourth. And then weathering that Mavericks run where they closed the lead to 1 point and then ultimately pulling away and winning, because in the past, Celtics teams in the past would have lost that game. It just goes to show that they've really built a certain character. They never say die. They never want to lose. They just have a relentless drive to the ultimate goal of hanging Banner 18 in the TD Garden rafters. But the bigger surprise to me is Joe Mazzulla. Joe Mazzulla's decision-making in the postseason has been nothing short of interesting, yet very vital to how the Boston Celtics have been able to handle any real adversity that has come their way. Obviously, Kristaps Porzingis has been out for large periods of time, and the question marks around the Celtics, and specifically Joe Mazzulla in particular, was how do you mitigate for that? How do you kind of revolve around the lack of big man depth and find an answer for teams that, play fast and teams that have superstars in the Mavericks, but you really have to be wary of. And I'm really shocked that Joe Mazzulla picked Xavier Tillman, but kudos to Xavier Tillman. I kind of want to go over his fantasy stats because he's never had such a prominent role in terms of fantasy as he did last night, but congratulations to him. 10.8 fantasy points, nice little utility option. 3, 4, and 2 blocks off the bench, a huge asset for them. And just go to show Joe Mazzulla's willingness to stick to the status quo, never change for your opponent, saying to Xavier Tillman, look man, you're not necessarily the best player on this team, but you are on this team. You are a squad player. You play for the identity and sake of this team. Go out there and keep doing what Celtics basketball is. And Xavier Tillman did that to a T. Now, the whole question surrounding the reason why it was Xavier Tillman is a good one because, as we've seen in the past, Joe Mazzulla hasn't been really reliant on bench depth outside of guys like Al Horford. But when he has been, they have been in very critical situations. We saw in Game 3 of the Pacers series when Joe Mazzulla decided to use O'Shea Brissett in a heavy minutes rotation. And O'Shea Brissett was a huge help playing small ball center against a much faster-paced Indiana Pacers team. Now, do I necessarily think that going forward, if Kristaps Porzingis isn't ready to go for Game 4, isn't fully fit, that he'll necessarily change? No. Joe Mazzulla is not known for changing. Joe Mazzulla is going to stick with what the Celtics organization, the Celtics identity is, and it just so happened that Xavier Tillman was the guy that Joe Mazzulla entrusted in that role. I think that guys like Luke Kornet, even Svi Mikhailiuk, O'Shea Brissett, Neemias Queta can also be a huge asset with his length and versatility. But Joe Mazzulla, there's something to be said about managing these lower-level big men in the squad where all the question marks are surrounding them and saying, look, guys, one of you is going to be the guy on each and every single night, on any given night, to step up into that role if need be. Look, we're down our best big man. Kristaps is out. Who is going to be the guy for me that I want to decide? And he has been masterful at that. He's been masterful at finding the weaknesses in other teams, and with or without Kristaps Porzingis, being able to decipher how he's going to use the limited depth, the only weakness, in my opinion, in Boston's squad, to elevate his team to their ultimate goal. So kudos to Joe Mazzulla. And let's switch back to the Mavericks. Obviously, I'm happy for Kyrie Irving that he had a better game. He broke the duck. He got out of his slump and really helped the Dallas Mavericks make this a game when they were down that big deficit early in the third and early in the fourth. And so I think that Kyrie Irving is my fantasy star of the game for just showing some moxie in a tough time. But ultimately, I think the big storyline here is the fact that Luka Doncic, the question remains whether or not, if but kind of thing revolving around his fouling out, his fallout in this game really misrepresented how good he is. Because in that game setting, I really think it was a weird circumstance for Luka to kind of come out there frustrated, aggressive, and physical. Because look at what the Celtics have done to him, and look at what he's done to the Celtics. Luka Doncic on every single possession has been picked up almost immediately after the ball has been inbound. He has been pressured the full length of the court. And he still had been putting up huge fantasy points, over 60 points in both games. And this is the only night in the NBA Finals where he did not go over that 60-point threshold. So I'm really not that concerned about Luka Doncic. It was just one of those moments where a superstar up against a super team kind of had a meltdown that you have to expect at some point, because it always happens. It's inevitable. When you're a player in this league who really wants to do well, really wants to help his team, you kind of push. And sometimes that pushiness turns into aggression, and that aggression ultimately turns into foolish decisions. So, while I do think that Luka Doncic had a very unprofessional moment, it's kind of a moment he'll shake off, and he's going to be looking to get back into that mindset of aggression and physicality, but in a way that really helps his team as they go into Game 4. But that should just about do it for this segment of the show. I really enjoyed trying to break down this kind of confusing game, especially in terms of fantasy implications, because it was just so weird with all of the question marks surrounding the absences of players and what happened in the latter stages of the game. Coming up next, an even more interesting segment. We kind of talked a little bit about fantasy football, but never about a certain player. Darren Waller announcing his retirement earlier this week, and how it changes the tight end fantasy landscape, both in the NFL as a whole and for the New York Giants. Ooh, that should be ugly. You don't want to miss this segment. It should be a great one. We'll be right back to discuss the fallout of that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk with